Good afternoon, friends joining us from Europe, and good evening to my fellow Asians. Welcome to this workshop discussion on how trade deals fuel climate breakdown and what can we do about it. This discussion is jointly organized by the Climate Change and Just Transition Cluster and the Trade, Justice, and Corporate Accountability Cluster of AEPF, spearheaded by the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, or APMDD, 1111, Global Justice Now, Focus on the Global South, the Transnational Institute, and the Indonesia for Global Justice, or IGJ. I'm Joseph Puruganan from the Focus on the Global South, joining from the Philippines, and I'll be the moderator for our discussion. The central question that we hope to tackle today is how trade deals exacerbate the climate crisis, a crisis that has been turbocharged by an extremist market knows best global economic system, which trade rules embed in our lives. When alternative approaches are suggested that could create a more sustainable world, all too often the reply is we can't do that because it's against trade rules. And in the midst of another crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, rather than reflecting on the devastating impact of these free trade and investment agreements on people's lives, people's health and well-being, and on the environment and climate, governments have doubled down in pushing the corporate free trade agenda amidst the global health crisis. The conclusion, for example, of RCEP in November last year, now considered the largest FTA, is driving the agenda for more and more FTAs in the name of COVID-19 economic recovery. Our response as activists is simple. We need to change the trade rules. We need a transformation of the economic system if we are to truly address this interconnected crisis. In this workshop, we will zero in on trade deals and explore how these agreements, one, have the power to override climate goals, how these agreements block climate action, and how they can make the climate crisis worse and prevent a just transition and a low carbon future. We will also explore how we can take action to stop high-risk trade deals like the RCEP, get rid of particularly damaging measures such as corporate courts and ISDS, and how we build progressive alternatives that could work for people and planet. As we say, we can't fix the climate without fixing trade, and can't think about these issues as existing independently from each other. To help us unpack these issues, we have invited three speakers. I'll introduce them as they are about to speak. Each speaker would have 15 minutes for their presentation, and then we will have a 30-minute Q&A open forum after all three speakers have presented. Of course, the chat box is another space for interactive participation, and feel free to put down your comments and questions there, and we will refer to them throughout the course of our discussion. So to start us off, let me invite Jean Blaylock to give us an overview of trade impacts to climate actions. Jean leads the trade campaign at Global Justice Now. She has been working on trade and food campaigning for over 13 years. Jean, you have the floor.
Thanks, Joseph. Okay, so I will try and give a bit of an overview around the ways in which trade deals are a problem for climate action, the ways in which trade can make the climate crisis worse, the ways in which trade rules can block climate action, and a bit about what we can do about it. Apologies if what I am saying is things that you are already familiar with. I'm not quite sure. I feel like there's probably quite a lot of expertise amongst all of the people who are joining this workshop, which will be great for the discussion. So just bear with me if what I'm saying are things that you are already familiar with. And one of the things that I just want to sort of start off with, which is a very basic thing, but it is so basic that I sometimes forget to say it, which is that the reason that we are talking about the impact of trade rules on climate is because trade deals are powerful. the way that we have set up our international system, international law, trade rules tend to override other areas of international law policy making, domestic policy making. It's for that reason that it's important to look at their impacts, because if we don't look at their impacts, they're likely to interfere with what we want to do. Having said that, I also need to remember to say, because sometimes I'm told that I give far too sort of scary and bleak a picture, trade rules are not unchangeable. They are not set in stone. They are not. They are not immutable. They are written by people and they can be changed by people. And public pressure has managed at times to change trade rules. But this aspect of trade deals being powerful is what trade rules and trade deals have always been about. I mean, going back hundreds of years, trade, empire, colonialism, the gunboats, there's always been power in there, intrinsic to the whole trading project. And to some degree, there are elements of that still, but the particular aspect in which they have a power now is the way in which they set the rules of the game for the global system and the international economy. In many ways, quite a lot of what's actually in trade rules has become disconnected from what most people think of as trade itself. I mean, actual trade between people back and forth has always been part of society. But trade rules have stopped being so much about just your normal need to exchange goods and services in order to enrich our lives, and they've become about a very particular economic outlook, extreme free market, market-oriented approach, an approach that, if you try and sort of bringing it up directly, overtly, it can be controversial. I mean, many of our governments unfortunately do, and it is controversial, and sometimes they win anyway. But if you want to avoid the controversy, one of the easy things to do is to take these approaches into a set of trade negotiations that are happening behind closed doors, in secret. Nobody really knows what they're about. They're full of jargon, they're full of technical words. It seems kind of obscure and you don't really know what it's on about. And then it's only later that you're having a discussion about how could we tackle the climate crisis, or how could we build an alternative food system, or any of the many things that we try to do in civil society and society generally. And somebody comes along and says, oh, well, it's a very interesting discussion what you're having, this whole thing about different things that we could do all over the place about tackling the climate emergency. But unfortunately, all of this stuff is against the trade rules. So you can only do this little bit here. This lot, fine in a utopian world, maybe, but unfortunately, it's just the reality. We can only do in this small circumscribed area, which is set out by the trade rules. And our approach is to say, no, trade rules are not something that need to have a greater imperative and greater reality than other things. If the trade rules are getting in the way of the things that we need to change in order to tackle the climate emergency, then it's the trade rules that need to change. Okay, so that's sort of the context in which I'm speaking. I will talk, as I said, a bit about just outlining some points about how trade can make things worse, how it can block action. I'll probably say more on the block action than the make worse, as I don't have masses of time. And I know that other speakers will probably pick up and go into more detail on some of the areas that I'm talking about. So in terms of making things worse, trade deals and trade rules can actually sort of encourage increased trade in fossil fuels at a time when we know that we should be keeping fossil fuels in the ground. Recent trade deals, for instance, that the US has done, has had specific provisions, tax breaks, that kind of thing, to encourage increased trade in fossil fuels. A few years ago, the proposed trade deal that was defeated between the EU and the US would have had clauses in there called energy neutrality clauses that would have said that you cannot treat renewable energies and fossil fuel derived energies differently, which is, you know, the exact opposite of what we need to be doing. So in that way, you can actually be contributing to this. And then, of course, also in an increase in trade in sectors that are carbon intensive, that are destructive to biodiversity and the climate. So in that way, trade deals can actually be contributing to the problem. What's maybe a bit more under the radar is how trade deals can actually block people from taking action. And this is one, so, I mean, there are many discussions at the moment out there in different times about different forms and different expressions around sort of how can we have some kind of global Green New Deal. I mean, these words are, I don't mean these words as sort of one person's specific Green New Deal. At the moment, it feels like everybody has their own their own Green New Deal. But these discussions are there. How could we have a whole different approach? And they're strategic discussions because they need to be, because we need to have a comprehensive shift in the way that our societies and our economies are oriented, because the climate crisis is so overarching. We know we need to shift a lot of things at once, and that needs a strategic approach. And that kind of strategic approach is exactly what trade deals undermine, because they all say, no, you can't have an interventionist strategic set of choices and interventions. You need to leave things to the market. So you have things where we know we've had a couple of decades really of lost action on climate, because we keep saying we don't want to regulate on this. I'm sure we can find a win-win solution. I'm sure that the market will take care of it. And this has not worked. We need to actually kickstart action, and to do that, we need strong and binding regulation. Then you have the trade rules that come along that says that regulation needs to be the least burdensome necessary for business, that you should be assessing your regulations not according to whether they are effective in achieving their purpose, such as in bringing down carbon emissions or facilitating other areas of environmental action, but are they the least burdensome necessary? And the least burdensome necessary will always be voluntary self-regulation. So the trade rules will bring us back to a situation where we cannot take the steps that we need to do because somebody will sit there and go, oh, that's a very interesting idea, but unfortunately somebody's going to challenge you if you do that, because it won't be there may be less burdensome ways of doing it, and therefore we need to have a deregulatory approach. In general, trade rules tend to have this overall deregulatory push, because they lead to a race to the bottom, with countries almost competing against each other in a deregulatory drive, which again is very damaging to what we know that we need to be doing for climate action. Another whole area is around the issue of technology transfer. So we need to be able to decarbonize our economies and societies. We need to be able to shift the ways in which we work and we produce and we travel, and the ways in which our houses are insulated and heated. And for all of these things, technologies are being developed, and they need to be spread, diffused around the world, shared, offered to everybody as fast as possible, so that change can happen as fast as possible. Unfortunately, trade rules, of course, have given this turbocharged power to intellectual property rules, patents, monopolies on those technologies, which, while they are supposed to support innovation, in fact, can tend to hinder the spread of those technologies. They're only available to the richest. They're only available to those who can afford it. And this is where the rich countries really use trade deals to hold on, to hoard their own resources for their own protectionism. And I mean, along with that, you also have clauses in some parts of trade deals around services, which will say, I mean, classically, you would want to say, set a set of conditions if you have a company seeking to invest in your country, you would want to ensure that there are benefits from that investment, benefits that are shared, one of which might be the transfer of technology, the sharing of, if this company moves in, that it brings technology with it and it shares that. And trade rules nowadays may specifically outlaw that. So you end up with this situation where because of the sort of the history, the history of all those power structures that trade deals were part of hundreds of years ago, and colonialism, you have trapped many countries in the global south with older, more carbon intensive technologies. Then you start saying that it's their fault for using those technologies, that they need to change, that they need to update, that you are going to penalize them if they don't. But in order for them to start using the new technologies, they need to pay the holders of the patents in the rich countries to access those patents, and they cannot use laws to try and ensure the spread of technology. I mean, it's one of the most egregious sort of blockings that trade rules do to prevent us from just getting on with the change that we need to do. The last thing I want to talk about is something that can be written into trade rules called investor-state dispute settlement, which we also call corporate courts, often in the UK, because that's effectively what they are. They enable a privileged legal system only accessible to corporations, allows corporations to sue governments outside of the national legal system over policy changes and laws, often for millions and increasingly for billions. These courts do not have to balance the public interest. They only need to look at the corporate interest. They've been used for just about everything over the past sort of 20, 30 years, challenging public health measures, challenging minimum wage, challenging banning toxic chemicals, challenging sugary drinks taxes, a whole range of things. There's always been a huge number of them that have been around environmental protections. And increasingly, in the last few years, we see the worrying trend that as governments maybe finally are beginning to take some of the climate action that is needed, corporations are turning to ISDS, to corporate courts, to challenge those. So notoriously at the minute, I suspect Cecily may talk more about this. The Netherlands is being sued by 2 energy companies at the moment over the phase out of fossil fuel. Other cases, there's a UK company that wants to start fracking in Slovenia, and the Slovenian government is requiring it to do more environmental checks than it wants to do, and it's planning to sue over that. A company called Lone Pine is suing Canada over a fracking moratorium. Another Canadian mining company suing also about phase out of coal power. So it's again, at a time when we know we need to be taking action, corporate courts are a tool that just offers itself up to fossil fuel companies as a way to slow down action, to make it more expensive, to hinder that action. I mean, it's often quite secretive, but in contrast to that, the cases that have been brought against the Netherlands have been being done quite publicly, at least in the sort of the overall drive, which I feel is seeking a chilling effect, that the target of those cases is not just the Netherlands, which after all is a fairly rich and powerful country. It is other countries around the world who may be looking at the situation there, looking at what's happening, may have been considering introducing the same sorts of measures or the same sorts of provisions, and maybe going, I might just hold off. I might do something weaker. I might do something less. I might just wait and see what happens. When again, we don't have time to wait and see what happens. We need to be taking action now, and corporate courts, ISDS, are an obstacle to achieving climate justice. So they are unjust in so many ways, but in particular, at the moment, the threat that they pose to climate action is an additional reason for getting rid of them. I will end just very quickly sort of on areas of what do we need to do to change this? I mean, we need to stop the bad deals. We need to stop the worst deals that are introducing these damaging laws and approaches. We need to reduce the power that trade deals have compared to other areas of policy making in international law. So where I started, the problem with trade deals is that they can override other things. Whereas it should be clear that, for instance, if there is a clash between your climate agreement and your trade agreement, or just your domestic climate policies, or health policies, or any other area, and your trade rules, it should be the trade rules that need to adapt to the overarching imperative of climate, of human rights, and the things that we actually value most in society. And one of the key ways to take away that power would actually be to get rid of ISDS. ISDS is one of the things that really gives teeth to trade rules. So getting rid of that would also help to weaken the power of trade rules to override other things. And finally, we need to transform our approach to trade rules. We need to take an entirely different, trade deals are premised on the idea that opening things up to the market is the solution to everything. That's what it says in the start of every trade deal, that it is seeking market liberalization, which means leading to more and more things being opened up to the market. We need to actually step back in the whole approach and say no, we need trade rules need to be not just about taking completely the brakes off trade and the market in an unfettered way. They need to be around finding the right balance between boundaries and enabling what's positive. To really do it properly would take quite a big rethink. It's not tinkering around the edges. We need a shift from thinking that the trade rules, as I say, are just about taking all the brakes off to them being about defining what's a useful framework, what's useful, what's not. It's a discussion that actually we need to be having in order to actually have agreement about what is considered constructive, what do we want. We need a progressive alternative coming from the left, because otherwise the only alternatives that are out there seem to be the ones that are coming from right-wing populists. So we need to really have a constructive view of how we could have a different approach to trade that would actually work for people and planet. Okay, I will leave that there as an overview, and I think other speakers will probably bring more depth and richness to what I was just trying to sketch there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jean, for that overview. You managed, I think, to cover all of the more notorious and contentious elements of these deals. And as you said, trade deals are indeed, trade deals are indeed powerful, and it's important to look at their impacts. And we're not just talking here of the climate change inducing trade, but also how these deals stymie climate action. But as you said, Jean, these rules are not set in stone, and public pressure has managed to change these rules. One such powerful agreement that is closely being monitored by both trade justice and climate justice activists is the Energy Charter Treaty. I am happy to introduce Cecilia Olivet, whom I've had the chance to work with on trade and investment issues for many years, who will provide us with more information on the Energy Charter Treaty and its implications on climate. Cecilia Olivet is a researcher with the Transnational Institute, an international research and advocacy institute where she coordinates the trade and investment program. She specializes in the international investment regime. Cecilia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Joseph. And yeah, really great to come after Dean that have already laid so much ground and made the good introduction, so I can skip through some things. I'm going to share my screen. This is it. So, one second. There we are. Yeah, so I, as Joseph said, will zoom in into this particular treaty. But before that, I mean, a lot of you have been part of many campaigns on trade agreements. I mean, RCEP, UASEAN FTAs of all kinds, CETA, TTIP. ISDS has been at the core of many of these campaigns for many years, but somehow, you know, as Joseph said, we've been working together on this for a very long time. But this one particular treaty has escaped public attention, and this is, oh, sorry, it's just that I'm seeing people popping in the waiting room. I don't know who's accepting them. Yeah, I'm going to zoom in this one particular treaty that has escaped all of us up till not so long ago in terms of public attention, and that is the Energy Charter Treaty. So what is it? Well, it's this one international investment agreement, but it also has other elements that was actually signed in the mid-90s. So it's part of the era of proliferation of investment treaties. You know, this is the evolution of the regime, and as many of you know, the 90s was the era where most of these treaties were signed, but also the Energy Charter Treaty in particular was signed very closely with another very contentious agreement, the Multilateral Investment Agreement, which was defeated. There was a big campaign opposing it. So while that took a lot of the attention and the focus and the limelight, the Energy Charter Treaty was signed almost at the same time with no attention and completely under the radar. So it's only many years later that, yeah, we kind of started to put the spotlight on it and seeing its implications. So what is it again? As I was saying, it's not just an investment agreement. It does include certain other elements, you know, on energy transit, on efficiency. It's a treaty focused on the energy sector, but the core of it, what makes it dangerous, what makes it, you know, what makes us talk about it is not all the other elements, is really the rights for foreign investors that are included in it and are at the core of this treaty, and also are being, you know, mainly debated today. So it grants these far-reaching protections for foreign investments in the energy sector. All of the traditional clauses that we would find in the more than 3,000 investment treaties signed around the world, we find them in its worst form in the Energy Charter Treaty. And basically, we also have clearly, as Jean was saying, you know, this mechanism that allows energy investors to sue states when they take measures that the investors feel have violated any of their rights or possibility to profit currently or in the future. So what also makes it different and so dangerous? So it's a multilateral treaty. We usually talk about bilateral investment treaties, maybe treaties between 2 or 3 countries like NAFTA. But this is a treaty that applies to 53 countries so far and counting, because it's on a process of expansion, and I will share a little bit more on that in a second. But so far, it applies to the whole of Western Europe, Central Asia, Japan is part of it, and more recently, Jordan and Yemen. And the European Union as EU is also a member. So that's also quite a characteristic, that is not just the member states of the European Union, but the EU itself, that it's a member of this treaty. we can also see in this graph the boom of cases over the last decade. So it's the one trade and investment agreement that has been used the most in the world to sue by investors. 135 known cases at the moment. Last decade, we saw this peak with more than a 437% increase in cases compared to the decade before. And as I said, it's a treaty that is expanding. So at the moment, the previous map that I showed was the current membership, but there is a whole process and a very aggressive process of expansion to try to attract new members, and particularly members from the global south. So while Africa is the continent that is more directly targeted and where most countries are at the moment in the process of joining, there's also quite a few Asian and Latin American countries that have taken some of these steps that are required to join the ECT. So this table basically shows you the different steps that governments have to go through, and there are countries that are, spread throughout. But particularly, so if we focus on Asian countries, you have South Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, China, and Pakistan that are in one of these 4 steps so far. And then the Philippines that hasn't taken step 1 yet, but has been in active contacts with the Secretariat of the Energy Charter, who is one of the main drivers of this process. So they are the ones that are promoting the expansion, that are also engaging with governments, and that are receiving, for example, some of the officials from these governments that are in the accession process to prepare the accession reports in their own, in Brussels. No? So people from, for example, and it's the energy ministries that are being particularly targeted. So you will have people, for example, from Vietnam or Cambodia that would come to Brussels for a year as a secondment to prepare all these reports. And this is being facilitated by the Secretariat itself. So this is also for us quite, it's not just the danger for the current members, but also all these other countries that are in the process of joining at the moment, without much attention, without much discussion, again, very much under the radar that this is going on. So as I was saying, this is a treaty that is only protection, about protection for energy investors. And the main danger of it is that it's designed to protect the status quo. And as Jean was saying, what we need is at this moment is to change the status quo. The status quo is investment in fossil fuels. And that is, by definition, a continuous of the climate catastrophe and the climate crisis. So we need to reverse that. We need changes in closing down of coal, oil, gas projects. We need to scale down. We need to stop new projects. We need to cut subsidies. And all these changes are exactly the type of changes that the Energy Charter Treaty would undermine. And it would undermine it because on the one hand, it could make this energy transition much more costly for governments because they are being sued and they would have to pay compensations much higher than they would normally do without this mechanism. But also it has a regulatory chill effect. So it discourages governments from implementing some of these actions for the fear of being sued for millions and billions as it's happening. So it really has this, and for a long time, we were warning of this, but over the last few years, this has started to really materialize in very concrete cases. And this is what I also wanted to, Jean already mentioned quite a few, so that's great. But as you can see, we have at the moment several cases that exemplify the power that this treaty gives to big energy companies. So the case, for example, of company Rockhopper suing Italy for the decision of the government to stop the oil and gas projects near the coast of Italy. Company is demanding $350 million in compensation. Vattenfall, it's a Swedish energy company, suing Germany for the decision to accelerate exit of nuclear energy after Fukushima. These are maybe the most known cases, but more recently, as Jean was just mentioning, there's these two cases that were actually filed over the last few months. And these are two cases against the Netherlands, two German companies, RWE and Uniper, that are suing the Netherlands using the Energy Charter Treaty for the decision of the government to phase out coal by 2030. RWE is claiming 1.4 billion euros. Uniper, still not clear, but between 850 and 1 billion. And it's interesting to know that these companies have started operations in the Netherlands in 2015, 2016. So we're not talking about 20 years ago. We're talking just a few years ago, after the signing of the Paris Agreement, after they knew that governments had to change the use of fossil fuels. After they knew that the price of fossil fuels would be declining and some of these would become stranded assets anyway. And yet, even after this decision of the government, the Dutch government actually offered these companies compensation. So they offered RWE 512 million, but also a transition period of 10 years, and also to use those power plants for other purposes. The same to Uniper, but they said, no, thank you. We'll just take our chances and we go to international arbitration, because that's much more lucrative. I mean, you can see what they are demanding, and there's good basis to think that because of how ISDS works, because how biased the system is, because how arbitrators are so entangled also with corporations and with the fossil fuel industry, that they could expect bigger wins from these lawsuits than what the government offered them in the first place. So I put that quote from Bart Jaap from SOMO, who has been following these cases very closely, because I think it really summarizes the power that these treaties gives to companies, but also the outrageousness of what they're able to do by using these treaties. How far away has the system gone, and it's being abused, in this context. So he's saying these companies could have foreseen CO2 reducing measures years ago, yet they willingly decided to open brand new coal plants in 2015, 2016. They are now saddled with stranded assets, which they seek to shift to Dutch taxpayers by using the Energy Charter Treaty. So this is the total opposite of what should be happening. They should be held accountable for contributing to global warming and climate change. Instead, they are being compensated for it. So this is the situation we are having. It's a very awful, I would say, situation that governments are in. It's either they allow to continue the pollution, or they have to face massive compensation. But just to also finish on a happy note, the resistance is growing. More than 1 million people have already signed a petition asking for the end of the Energy Charter Treaty. The numbers are growing, and there are much more voices joining. There's a big backlash against this treaty, but also it's not just about the ECT, clearly, as Jean mentioned it. But yeah, I think there is a little bit of hope that people, now that we put a spotlight on this, we could also show the dangers, and there might be a chance to get rid of it. So I will leave it here, and yeah, this is just some more resources, but I think this is good to go into the discussion and just
Excellent. Thanks.
thanks.
Thanks, Cecilia. If you want to post the link to the petition so that people can sign up, if there's one, you can add it in the chat. That'd be great. So
yeah, actually,
again,
there's two things going on. One is the petition, which is for individuals, but we also have a sign-on open for organizations.
Yeah.
So I will post both links.
Thanks. Thanks again, Cecilia. So our first two speakers, Jean and Cecilia, have clearly established how these trade agreements block climate action by punishing, in fact, regulations and actions aimed to address climate change, and how these deals really give primacy to the corporate agenda over public interest. For our third and final speaker, I think we shift gears a bit as we focus on deals of another kind, the so-called green kind, green deals that purportedly incorporate already the environmental or climate agenda. Vicente Paulo B. Yu III, or Vice, will talk about Green New Deals and WTO, including proposals for carbon tax border adjustments. Vice is currently a senior legal advisor at the Third World Network, a visiting research fellow at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, and an associate fellow at the Geneva Center for Security Policy. Previously, he served as a deputy executive director of the South Center from 2016 to 2018, the Intergovernmental Policy Research Institution of Developing Countries based in Geneva. And between 2002 to 2019, he coordinated the South Center's work on global governance, climate change, investment, South-South cooperation, and sustainable development issues. We invite comments and questions in the chat box as well as on the floor in our open forum later. Vice, you now have the floor. Thanks.
Thank you, Joseph. Maraming salamat, and hello to everyone. I'm Vice Yu, and Joseph introduced me. We're proud to say that I also come from the civil society movement from the Philippines. I've worked with Joseph for quite a long time when I was with Friends of the Earth in the Philippines. So it's like a circling back for me after spending a huge amount of time working with governments, developing country governments in the international arena. It's good for me to be back with you all and sort of like share some of the thinking that we've been involved in, at least with Third World Network and in terms of my previous work as well at the South Center on issues of trade and climate change, because these are some of the issues that we have been deeply sort of like engaged in over the past 2 decades or so. I'm going to share my screen because I put together a PowerPoint, which I will run very quickly through because I know that time is also running very fast for us. So let me just put it up here. Okay, so I think what I would like always to start, and this is sort of like something that we tend to sort of like often forget, special governments, right? Not for those of us who are on this call, but for governments especially, is that there is still this huge development gap. Let me just, I don't know how to move my screen, but anyway, but there's this huge development gap currently exists, despite the advances that, you know, many of the commentators, the mainstream economic commentators always say have taken place over the past few decades. And that translates, I think, in many ways to this chart, in the sense that when we look at, for example, that development gap, and then look at where growth in terms of GDP have been coming from, and the way in which that growth has been fueled by fossil fuels because of the technologies. I think it was both Jean and Cecilia were saying that technologies that have been transferred to developing countries because of offshoring or because of global trade, free trade and all that. we see this graph where there is a very close correlation, in fact, between GDP growth and emissions growth. And that's because of the kinds of energy technologies that we use, the kinds of resources, the fossil fuels that many countries use for energy. And this is particularly interesting because for developing countries that were in the 80s very low in terms of this graph, as they moved up in terms of, for example, the integration into the global economy that was fostered by the WTO, emissions also started growing. Whereas developed countries, the red line here, there is virtually no change in terms of the correlation between emissions growth and GDP growth, as you can see here. So what this essentially means is that, for example, 1% of GDP growth, which, for example, might have been triggered by international trade, translates into an almost corresponding 1%, in this case 0.6, somewhere around that percent increase in emissions growth. And that's really largely because of the kinds of technologies that we tend to use for energy, for transport, for mining, and all of those other things. And what that has meant is that the inequality in terms of development, the differences in terms of development conditions that we see among countries tended to layer themselves on over the past several decades in terms of inequalities with respect to how impacts are addressed, with respect to how impacts are felt coming from climate change, and in terms of how the economic and social and political conditions are being reflected and being addressed as well. So, for example, and this is sort of like a chart that I often tend to use to show where the relationship between GDP and development, for example, using GDP as a very, very inaccurate proxy in a way, and overall vulnerability to climate change impacts, and sort of like a manifestation of the social and political instability that we see there. So, for example, if you have if you layer where the world's poorest countries are, most of them would be here in this band. And they also happen to be among the most vulnerable, largely because of not only the physical climate impacts, but also because of the economic vulnerability that underdevelopment creates. And as projections, in terms of projections, as we heat up the planet even more, that is where the greater levels of stress, of economic stress, are going to come in as well. So the deeper reds correlate to each other, and if you look down here, that's where then you see masses of people moving to where they hope to get to greener pastures as well. So there is a huge complex context and situation in which one can see sort of like this layering between development, between climate change, between fossil fuel use, and economic and social and political conditions sort of like that we have to address altogether. And this is why equity is so important. And when we talk about green deals and trade and border adjustments, we often sort of like have to go back and really talk about equity as a basic principle, and that is sort of like reflected really in how we tend to shape responses to the climate emergency and to the damage, the development damage that a lot of the global economic policy regimes have created for many developing countries. And so you see here, for example, in not only in treaty text in the UNFCCC, but also in terms of what developing countries have been saying, for example, in the climate negotiations, what NGOs have been saying in terms of how to achieve the Paris goals. Equity is sort of like a key foundational principle that really needs to be reflected. And how do you do that given this context that we are in, where you have many challenges that we face in the global south? We know that we will be facing long-term global economic weakness. not only because of climate change, but also because of the economic conditions that have been created by the neoliberal economic regime that that has been in dominant play over the past 30, 40 decades, 30, 40 years. We know that there will be severe impacts on many developing country economies because of various economic crises. In environmental crises, we see huge, massive increases in net capital outflows. We see a debt crisis emerging. It's already happening. We see political instability, migration, and of course the COVID pandemic. And then layered on top of that is the weakening level of North-South cooperation in many areas, with protectionism now being seen, and xenophobia, especially in developed countries. And on top of that, you have uncertainties in whether we can in fact access the sufficient amounts of climate finance and technology that we actually need to undertake climate action in a way that also matches the need to eradicate poverty in developing countries. And I think one of the longer term, medium term to longer term challenges that the global South will face is this how to address this sort of like conundrum, because what we often hear now in the mainstream media is that we need to have urgent action, and yes, that is true. But even if we do urgent action now, in terms of reducing emissions, for example, globally, the impact, the net positive effects of those urgent actions are going to be seen and felt by developing countries, for example, only after the year 2100, which means that between now to the year 2100, or even up to the year 2150, there will still be increases in temperature. There could most likely be increases in terms of loss and damage, which therefore need to be adapted to and addressed. And unfortunately, that part of the equation is often left behind because of this focus among those who claim themselves to be leaders in global climate action on greenhouse gas emissions reductions. And I'll explain exactly sort of like how that then translates into the Green Deal. One of the, I think, narratives that we often hear is that the EU, for example, and now with the US under Biden, are leaders in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But are they really? And this graph that I'm trying to show here, I wish I could get rid of this thing here. This graph that I'm showing here came from the UNFCCC Secretariat. And what it essentially says is that these green bars from 1990, 2000, 2010, 2017, and 2020, what these green bars here represent are the total emissions from what we call in the climate negotiations non-economies in transition Annex 1 parties, meaning the developed country parties that are from Western Europe, plus the US, Canada, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and basically those countries. And what it essentially shows is that over, and Jean is absolutely correct, I think, when she mentioned this briefly earlier, is that since 1990 up to the year 2020, and that's essentially a span of almost roughly 30 years, the developed countries who now portray themselves to be leaders in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, in fact, have not reduced their greenhouse gas emissions. We must remember that under the Climate Convention, they were supposed to have gone down in terms of their greenhouse gas emissions from to 1990 levels by the year 2000. When the convention was adopted in 1992 and entered into force in 1994, developed countries were going up in terms of their emissions, and they were supposed to bring that down back to 1990 levels. Under the Kyoto Protocol, they were supposed to go below by about 5.8%, below 1990 levels. And under the second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol that ended last year in 2020, they were supposed to go to 18% below 1990 levels. But as this graph shows, and this graph is based on data which they themselves, the developed countries themselves, gave to the UNFCCC Secretariat in terms of the greenhouse gas inventories, they have not complied with that commitment at all. They have increased by the year 2000, and by the year 2020, they have essentially been above where they were in 1990. So they're not leaders as far as I'm concerned, as far as many developing countries also are concerned. So when you have then developed countries coming in and claiming that they're leaders in reducing greenhouse gas emissions or leaders in climate actions, those claims ring hollow for many developing countries because they see the data and they know that the data clearly shows that developed countries have not led at all, and in fact are just saying hollow words there. And the failure of many developed countries, in fact, to reduce emissions is even worse when you compare it to the fair shares that they're supposed to undertake. Fair shares are those the amount of emissions that they should be reducing relative to how much they had overconsumed since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And what many of the civil society organizations that have been part of this fair shares approach, including Friends of the Earth, for example, have been saying is that the fair shares, when you look at what developed countries have committed under the Paris Agreement and what they should actually be doing, what their commitments are under the Paris Agreement are very, very, very low compared to what they should be doing in terms of their fair shares, which means that there is inequality and there is huge inequity in terms of how we approach this climate change issue. Because if you again look at just the carbon footprint and what developing countries are doing, you have in terms of the context that they're in terms of the development context, there is a huge disparity, which is not to say that developing countries should not do more. In fact, they should do more, but doing some more also needs to be contextualized in terms of how the UN Climate Convention should be implemented. So what's the role of the WTO in this area? And I think Joseph said it first when in his opening remarks. What the WTO has been doing and what the developed countries in the WTO have been doing is that they have been doubling down on and they have been piggybacking on the issue of climate change as a way to double down on their existing trade liberalization agenda. So you had, for example, these negotiations that have essentially collapsed from 2002 to 2008. Nothing has been moving forward. And what we're now seeing is that we are seeing developed countries putting forward issue after issue related to climate change and the green economy in the WTO. We're seeing the Secretariat in the WTO responding to that as well, despite not having any mandate from the member states. And I think one of the ways in which we can see really that doubling down is this increase in terms of proposals and initiatives coming from developed country members. For example, the Environmental Goods Agreement by 18 countries, 18 parties, this trade and environment sustainability discussions, this informal dialogue on plastics, a Japanese proposal on carbon neutrality, an agreement on climate change, trade, and sustainability. All of these are in effect doubling down on the idea that climate change can be addressed through trade liberalization of environmental goods. But what these proponents often do not say, in fact, they do not say, is that when they talk about environmental goods, they talk about the products in which they themselves have the major export interest in because they're the only ones that produce those products. The Japanese proposal, for example, is particularly insidious in a way because they're also talking about rulemaking in terms of closing down a policy space so that countries will no longer be able to do domestic regulation if needed as appropriate in terms of changing their tariff structure or changing the kinds of domestic regulations they put in place for climate change. The EU's Green Deal and the US and Canada in terms of and the UK's approach to the G7 presidency in terms of pushing for a carbon border adjustment mechanism is one of those things. I think that we have to look at carefully, because when we look at these carbon border adjustment measures, it's really about, again, doubling down on the use of trade liberalization as a tool for climate policy, even if in the first place it was a lot of it was because of massive levels of trade liberalization that actually triggered increases in consumption and traded goods across the world, which then uh, generated increased levels of emissions. If you calculate it from a consumption basis. The most often cited policy rationale for CBAMs is to address competitiveness in order to prevent carbon leakage in a way where, for example, the EU is saying that, other countries have less strict or are less ambitious on climate change. And therefore, we have to bar their products from entering the EU, so that they themselves, the other countries, will then be pushed to be more ambitious. And if you're more ambitious, then your products can enter the EU. But what I think that, what that downplays and what that disregards is that, I think, again, Jean pointed this out earlier, you do have a historical and developmental context in that many of the emitting industries had been offshored already to developing countries, and now you're punishing them for doing the dirty work for you. So it's that kind of inequity. I think that kind of ethical considerations of like that then creates this issues that I'm raising in this slide in terms of the perceptions and the risks and the difficulties that one could raise against the use of carbon border adjustment measures as a tool for dealing with climate change. Not least because it's hypocritical, it's incoherent, but also because it runs the risk of creating a punitive regime that could actually create more harm, especially to developing countries, than it would do good. And it also runs and it does not address the structural difficulties that we face as developing countries, and it creates the potential of increasing green market technology market concentration and monopolization for developed countries. Of course, it's not going to be effective in meeting climate change objectives either, because it's costly, it's difficult to administer, and we are not very sure exactly whether it will in fact prove to reduce emissions. So CBAMs are, from our perspective as TWN, green protectionism, because when you dig deep into what the policy rationales are, it's really about country first, the America first, or the UK first, or the EU first, and then it's also about having a self-indulgent image of that particular country as being a climate leader when in fact they are not. And therefore you have these questions that need to be addressed in that context. So for developing countries, CBAMs are no-go, and then countries have already expressed that very clearly. So what should we do when we talk about the green economy, right? When we talk about the green economy, clearly there is no centrally agreed concept about that. What we have been saying, and which we have worked with developing countries in the past to say, was to really sort of like peg the green economy idea to the 3 pillars of sustainable development, with recognizing the economic and social value of the environment, but really centralizing it around the idea that you do need to regulate the market, because it was the market that created the problem in the first place when it comes to climate change. And you need to focus on structural and systemic changes in international economic governance frameworks so that we can do all of those systemic things that need to be undertaken in order to correct the system that has brought us into this global warming world that we are facing. So what should a green economy or a green deal be? One, it should not be one-dimensional, meaning it's not about the environment simply or about greenhouse gas emission reductions, but it's really about equity. which means that it's not one size fits all, not justifying unilateral trade protectionism and all of those other things that I have listed down in this slide. So what should be done? What we have been saying, and what we suggest with many of the governments that, for example, I have worked with in the past in the South Center, but also with TWN in terms of the work that we do in the climate negotiations, is to really push for a more focus on domestic mitigation within, I'm sorry, this should be developed countries. Domestic mitigation within developed countries, especially leading towards meeting more of their fair share, looking for a waiver of TRIPS enforcement of corporate-owned IPRs, calling for a moratorium on WTO dispute settlement, for example, looking at technology transfer and capacity building. And I think more importantly, these two things here. One is on development financing support, developing country being financed to undertake a combination of climate change and sustainable development action through both the convention, the climate process, but also through debt moratoriums, debt cancellation, reforms of the global tax system, including the tax regimes, and pushing for more grant and concessional financing to support, so to change the direction of MDB financing away from fossil fuels towards economic diversification. And that's the last major point I want to raise here, which is that for us, when we look at the long term, a green economy really is about, a Green Deal really is about channeling resources to where it needs to be in order to support economic diversification, especially among developing countries, and economic diversification in a way that moves economies forward away from climate vulnerable sectors, away from fossil fuel dependency, towards sectors which could actually trigger greater reliance on renewable energy, and then greater support for say more community-oriented economic activity, so that the income distribution within countries would be more equal and more equitable in a way. So let me end here. There are some readings that I could suggest in terms of for you to look at. One is a new book which we have published in TWN on green deals and its implications, from which I drew a lot of this presentation, and previous publications that my former boss Martin Corr and myself have written on some of these topics. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vice, for unpacking the proposals for Green New Deals and really the need to really examine them more closely. Now we've finished with the three speakers, and we're happy to entertain some questions. Like I said earlier, if you prefer to write your questions down in the chat box, please do that. But if you also prefer to articulate your questions yourself, please just raise your hand and we will call you. Let me see, are there any raised hands already? Yes, Gus, is it Gus? Gus?
Yes.
Sorry, yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you. In English, it's Gus, and in Dutch, it's Guus.
Gus.
It's the last presentation is very thought-provoking. I first introduced myself. I work with farmers organizations in the Netherlands against free trade deals. For example, since '62 there are no import tariffs on soybeans, so we cannot compete with soybeans. Our arable farmers want to produce protein and oil crops themselves, but it's impossible because there's no import tax. And that means that we take away natural resources from the south, also by importing palm oil, biofuels, leading to massive problems for indigenous people, small farmers in the global south. So we propose an import tax to make European self-sufficiency more possible. And now it looks like this is called green protectionism. So I think if you say the West is protecting the markets, it's also unable to protect markets in the global South. Those climate figures, which are mentioned mostly, we are only responsible for what we produce, but not for what we consume. So even those climate figures are not fair because the Brazil, Indonesia is responsible for our consumption because they cut forest for us. So I still we propose more protection for regional or country self-sufficiency in agriculture and industry. Africa can't compete with China and EU on industry, so they are for decades they are just delivering raw materials. So I thought they would also need protection to also to be more self-sufficient in agriculture. Because climate change is of course coming, but also to develop their own industry. So now I'm confused with the last presentation. Thanks for your reaction.
Okay, so Gus, you wanted a clarification on the position on the proposal for an import tax. Is
Yeah,
that
import
correct?
tax is compared to this carbon border adjustment. You can
Yep.
compare it with an import tax. We propose still import taxes on soybeans, not only for climate,
it.
but just we want to be more self-sufficient in Europe
Yes, yes.
and get less resources from the global South.
Okay. Vice, you want to address that now, or should we take a couple more questions?
Let's take a couple more questions, and then
Okay.
I think it
Take
might be
take
easier.
note of that
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, are there any more questions? I don't see any hands raised. Let me check the chat box here. So maybe you can address the question now, Vice.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Gus, for that question. It's something that we have really been struggling with, right? Because of the work that we do also with communities, and recognizing that that even in the global north, you do have local communities that are being impacted by these trading arrangements that we have. And I think one of the ways that we can address that really is to look at at it in a way where one, for example, you in the global north, demand needs to be increased for locally produced products. And but at the same time, what we the equity side of it as well is that we also realize that there are countries and communities in those countries that would be reliant on the demand, say, from Europe for their export agriculture products. And I think the challenge here for us is to see that the income needs, for example, of small European farmers are the same as what the income needs of farmers in the Philippines would be, or Indonesia would be. And the issue is not to pit them against each other, but to see that both of them are actually suffering from the same international trading regime that we are all subject to at the moment. And so one way to address that could be to say, okay, you increase domestic demand for local farm products within Europe, maybe not through an import tax, because that might adversely harm farmers in the Philippines or Indonesia, but through other means, whether it's through regulation incentivize the increase in domestic consumption of domestic goods. But at the same time, in order to address the fall in demand for imported products, there should also be some kind of international cooperation arrangement where um, uh, farmers in the Philippines, farming communities in the Philippines or in Indonesia or Uruguay or Argentina are assisted to move away from export agriculture dependence, um, and focus on building domestic food sovereignty and food security by producing crops for their own people rather than producing crops for consumption in Europe, right? And that's the sort of like the missing link that we face, because when you use import taxes to bar imports from elsewhere, then we run the risk of harming those who could actually be allies for us. So I think that's one of those main issues that we have to struggle with, because the use of a carbon border adjustment measure or an import tariff is all too often it can be a blunt instrument. um, and I think we have to be a bit more uh, clear and nuanced in terms of what kind of policy measures we will be pushing in order to address the needs of both the home, the home economies, the home communities, and the communities from other countries that will also be in as great need of, for example, poverty eradication or economic development as we would have. Thank you.
Could I react?
Go ahead, Gus, very quickly because we don't have
Yeah.
so much time. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you remember 2002, the campaign of Oxfam Novib, Make Trade Fair, and they also said the West should not protect markets. And I think Vandana Shiva had lots of critics on this, because then you go in the trap of the neoliberals to get to free trade. And I think the most who favor free trade are, of course, the transnational corporations. And food sovereignty means you need to produce food for your own people, like Fai said. So it's impossible without protecting markets. And I think still the Global South has the most to suffer. That's not only by WTO, but of course by the structural adjustment programs of World Bank, IMF, which they had to already liberalize the markets before WTO. So I think it would be a mistake to say, no, let's get rid of import taxes, because like I said, then it's a race to the bottom, and the biggest company wins, and not the small, medium enterprises and the small farmers. But yeah, we need more time for this, I think.
Yeah, we need another conversation on that very important issue. There's a comment question on the chat box here. Is there an alternative formulation of a CBA where the funds could be directed to support the kind of IP transfer / sustainable regional production needed or not? I guess it's addressed to you again, Vice.
Yeah, that's thanks for that, Kira. That's one of the, I think, questions, especially for the EU, right? If you were to put in place a border adjustment measure, where will the revenues go? And what will it be used for? And from at least what I'm hearing from our EU colleagues is that it looks to be more of a general revenue generating mechanism. Can it be used policy-wise to support, say, technology transfer or increase development or climate financing to developing countries? Actually, we're not. We are thinking it through in a way, because sometimes what it feels like is you are. It could be seen as a way of developing countries then self-financing themselves, because you raise the for example, you raise the taxes, the import tax. You get the money from that import tax, which it will have to be paid by the exporter from the developing country, and then transfer it back, right? So it's like us, but then the developed country then gets the credit for saying that, well, that's support that you're giving. So it's it's a complex thing that we have to look at. But one of the things really that is needed, and maybe in one of the part of the response to your question, Kira, is where do you get the climate finance that needs to go to developing countries from? So obviously, one of those things will have to be increase the supply of climate finance that flows from developed to developing countries. But the other side of that equation is to decrease the outflow of financing from developing countries to developed countries, which means either you cancel debt, eliminate intellectual property royalties, change the the way in which global tax regimes actually encourage corporations to evade taxes in developing countries, do all of these things. So that will have to be, I think, part of the policy mix in terms of looking at where a CBA could fit in as a financing tool. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Vice. We're running out of time. I just want to bring in Jean and Cecilia again, and maybe redirect the conversation towards what can we do? The question of what can we do? This we pose a very big challenge of that. The situation that we are now is that there seems to be a primacy of these trade agreements over everything else, right? Primacy of trade agreements or WTO agreements over public health, as we are seeing now in the debate over the TRIPS waiver and such. So how do what do you see any possibilities for us sort of turning the tables around and saying that public health, human rights, the environment should have primacy over these agreements? And what are the, of course, we are all campaigners and we've done our part over the years to try and dismantle the beast, but are you seeing any positive avenues, new avenues that we can explore to effect this transformation? Maybe Jean, you want to start?
Yeah, and I mean, also just to say that I think that the conversations and the discussion that we've just had, just a very little bit of here with a couple of questions, are also incredibly important part of this, because I think they're all bringing up very real issue. I mean, on the sort of, in a sense, in the conversation around agriculture, I remember back in the mid-2000s being part of organizing a couple of sort of big global conversations in Geneva around literally trying to bring farmers groups together with development organizations to try and talk about these ideas around, and these ideas still face us. And I feel like the carbon border issue is perhaps going to become very much a focal point. The issues are not new, but it's a new way of us talking about, well, what is it that we want? What is it that we are trying to achieve? In terms of seeing opportunities, I do see I see opportunities in ISD. Two parts of the trading system that I feel over the last few years have become vulnerable. So maybe a few years ago it was perhaps coming out of the TTIPs and the TPP campaigning, that the ISDS system really became controversial and vulnerable, and has been put into question to the extent that governments are talking about, well, so, some governments, we don't want to just continue with business as usual. We do need to change things. Now, of course, for most of those governments, what they want to do is just tweak a few things around the edges, reform a little bit, and then continue with business as usual. But the fact that they even accept that change is needed means that there is a little bit of a door opening, and we can push on that further to say, no, it's not just a few reforms. it's a whole system that you just need to get rid of. It has it's not serving any fair or reasonable purpose. It's just adding to corporate power, and we don't lose anything by getting rid of the whole ISDS system. Let corporations sue in national courts if they have issues, get rid of ISDS. It's a vulnerability. And then, of course, over the last year, seeing a vulnerability open up for the first time for 20 years around IP, around TRIPS, around the trade rules on intellectual property. And I do see that as linking very much to what Vice has been talking about, also around the technology transfer for climate issues. And can we extend from the sort of there is the urgent need from the pandemic for a TRIPS waiver for the pandemic, but is there also an urgent need for a waiver over the climate emergency? And perhaps actually we can go beyond that and say, well, if every time we have an emergency, then we see that IP is, the trade rules on IP are something that we need to waive in order to deal with the emergency, then perhaps that's because they are a problem. Perhaps we need to actually rethink that. So while, as I was saying, I do feel that really we need a really philosophical change in approach to the whole system. I do see that those are two areas around ISDS and around intellectual property where there are perhaps openings for things that we could really be pushing for.
Thanks, Jean. Cecilia?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Jean. And just adding on that, and why I would advocate also to take these little opportunities, that are opening. And of course, the universe of what we need to tackle might seem massive. I mean, when you look into the issue of investment treaties, we're talking about over 3,000. So how do you deal with that? And it can sound totally overwhelming, but it's also, I mean, not all of them have the same effect. Not all of them are as dangerous. Not all of them have become toxic as some. So this is where, at this particular moment, the Energy Charter Treaty, for example, has become one of these, or is becoming one of these toxic deals where we do see opinion changing quite rapidly. Because it's indefensible. It's a treaty that protects oil, gas, and coal companies, the exact companies that do not need and should not be protected at this time and age. So I think, for me, it's really worrying because we know that getting out of treaties is one thing, and it's a difficult battle, but to see the rapid advance and the expansion and how treaties are falling for the same arguments, and joining a treaty that is so outdated and it's under so much controversy already without any backlash, it's really scary. So I would advocate, I think, for I think there is a real chance to stop the expansion and even to get some European countries to withdraw. And my feeling is that could have a domino effect. So that in itself won't solve the problem, but having, these bastions of examples of rollback of the system or put a stop to the system could really have an impact and a domino effect.
Yeah, thanks, Cecilia. Vice, do you want to? And we're winding down the discussion now. Unfortunately, it's 10 p.m. So unless there are other questions from the floor from our participants, I'd like to give the floor back again to our speakers for their final messages, starting with Vice. Vice, go ahead.
Yeah, nothing much to add really. Just a key point there that we are all struggling with I think the complexity of challenges that we are all facing in the trade regime and the climate regime. And so the solutions are not simple. So it's not going to be as simple as having a CBAM or a Green Deal or but it will have to be really systemic. So, and I think it is really all up to us to keep on pushing that kind of systemic and structural change narrative. Because the other side, the corporations, the governments that rely on these corporations will keep on pushing their own systemic narrative, which is that free trade is the answer to everything that ails this world, even though it's not. Thank you.
Thanks, Vice. Jean, your final messages? No more? Cecilia?
Well, just one word to say that I also feel that the only way we could really make some inroads, it's if we combine struggles. And in this case, where the reason why, for example, when you look at the Energy Charter Treaty, where we have been successful is when we join struggles with the climate movement and the trade movement and others, because and it's not about adding work to one or the other, but really just at the level of narrative, combining struggles and understanding that one cannot happen. I mean, you cannot advance an energy transition as long as you have these regimes in place. So yeah, I think that's the power that we have if we are able to really link up much more.
Okay. So let me thank again our three speakers, Jean Blaylock from Global Justice Now, Celia Olivet from TNI, and Vice Yu from the Third World Network, and all of you for participating in this joint workshop of the Trade Justice and the Climate Justice Cluster of AEPF. Obviously, it's a very complicated issue, but I see many of you are veteran trade and climate campaigners here. And of course, this is not the end of this conversation. Some of the proposals that came out of the discussion are still debatable, and we need maybe longer conversations and to build more international solidarity around some of those proposals for alternatives. But I think that the point of this conversation really is to highlight that the need to converge the struggles for climate and the struggles for trade justice to really converge, and this is a good starting point for that convergence. So again, on behalf of all the organizers, let me thank the speakers and all the participants for joining this conversation. And Rakmi is reminding us, I don't know if she put, okay, no more. So again, thanks everyone, and good afternoon and good night to my Asian colleagues. Thanks.